Um, yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Um, uh, Zeuler Lima is going to give us a great lecture tonight. It's part of the faculty lecture series. And this has been a really nice series this year as our faculty, especially our historians, have graciously donated their time to help fill out the lecture series. Um, and so Zeuler, as well as, we thank you for giving your time for this as well. For anybody seeking AIA credits, you can just put your name and number in the chat at any point during the lecture. I'll be recording those and we'll get those turned in. And I also want to let everybody know about upcoming lecture later this week. On March 4th, we have Amanda Williams in conversation with Giles Smith from Assemble. Amanda out of Chicago and Giles Smith out of London. It's going to be a really interesting lecture. It is noon on March 4th. So please go and register for that. I think this is going to be a really great conversation. And so now on to Zeuler. So Zeuler Lima is a leading authority on the architect Lina Bo Bardi. He wrote a book on her in 2013. This is really the first comprehensive study of the architect's life and work. He has also curated several exhibitions. In 2018, he did an exhibition on Albert Frei and Lina Bo Bardi, Search for Living Architecture in the Palm Springs Art Museum in California. Then in 2019, an exhibition called Hand Drawn, Architecture According to Lina Bo Bardi at the Joan Miró Foundation in Barcelona. Lina Bo Bardi was one of the most important architects of the 20th century. Was not really widely known as she deserves to be compared to the influence that she's had on the field. Other Brazilian architects, Oscar Niemeyer, Paulo Mendes de Rocha, are more well known. I think Zeuler is really doing a good part in trying to promote the work of Lina Bo Bardi. So he examines the impact of her living and working first in Italy and then in Brazil. And he relates various aspects of her multidisciplinary approach and projects. She wrote, taught, edited, and laid out magazines, curated and designed exhibitions, and designed furniture. Zeuler examines how ethical and social considerations influenced her intellectual engagement with modern architecture. So as you can see, Zeuler is definitely knows a lot about Lina Bo Bardi. Zeuler was educated in architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism at the University of Sao Paulo, with a postdoctoral education in comparative literature at Columbia University. He has done quite a bit of teaching, University of Sao Paulo, the École d'Architecture in Grenoble, Columbia University, University of Michigan, Hosei Daigaku in Tokyo, and of course is a faculty member here at Washington University. He has done additional curatorial work, a member of the advisory committees for the exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Museo de Casa Brasileira in Sao Paulo, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Architecture Museum in Munich, and the Johann Jakob Museum in Zurich. He's also been the recipient of the prestigious 2007 International Bruno Zevi Prize for Architectural History and Criticism. And he also does quite a bit of drawings and showing of his own drawings with solo exhibitions, which shows his multidimensional nature. So with that, we're really excited to have Zeuler Lima. So please help me welcome him.
Well, thank you, Chandler, for this incredible introduction, and you made my job so much easier. So now I don't have to talk about Lina Bo Bardi generically. I can just jump in and talk about the drawings because that has been my latest work about her. So what I will do, since this is a webinar, everybody's looking at a screen, and I try to make this as interesting as possible as an experience. So I'm going to talk and show some slides, and then I'm going to read very small excerpts from my book and dedicated to Lina Bo Bardi's drawings. I'm also going to show a documentary and then a short interview that is in video format. So that means that I'll try to make it as dynamic and as Gesamtkunstwerk, as very theatrical as Lina Bo Bardi herself liked it in the small screen. And so I'll have to move between different screens. So please be patient with that, but I try to make it as smoothly as possible. So let's initiate with some of the slides I'd like to share with you. And so you don't have to look at me, you can look at some more beautiful things. So here we have, so this talk is particularly dedicated to the exhibition that I organized for the Joan Miró Foundation when they one day called me in the fall of 2018, asking me if I was interested in doing a work with them by exhibiting the work of Lina Bo Bardi. And at that time, I was very interested in doing my own drawings, and I always had been interested in Lina Bo Bardi's drawings herself because she used it as a very a long-standing companion to her life. And I immediately suggested that since Joan Miró himself drew so much and so profusely and beautifully, why not have an exhibition only dedicated to Lina Bo Bardi's drawings? Which they embraced immediately and gave me complete freedom to work within the budget that was very small available at the time. So, and it was a wonderful exhibition for me because of the theme itself, Lina Bo Bardi and drawings, and especially because I really created very good relationships, and I worked with a wonderful team of people of all kinds in the museum and outside the museum. So it was one of those moments in life when you feel really fortunate to be doing the work that you do. So I would have an enormous number of people to thank for all this work. As Lina Bo Bardi used to say, I didn't do anything alone. I always did things with people. And this is clearly the case. I'm just trying to organize something for the audience. So I gave it a subtitle, Pictures at an Exhibition, because I'm particularly interested in music, and I try to even introduce music into this exhibition, as I'll mention to you at some point. But the image that comes to mind, of course, to people who now know about Lina Bo Bardi, is the collection space for the Museum of Art of São Paulo that she designed was finally opened in 1968, and has this quite revolutionary way of displaying works on glass easels, which are floating in the middle of the space, hovering as if in a constellation. And this is a classic image of her work. And for about 2 decades, it was removed from the museum after they passed away. I mean, Lina Bo Bardi and Pietro Maria Bardi, her husband. But then a few years ago, the museum director who replaced the previous administration decided to bring them back. And here you have an incredible image of the fantastic work of reconstitution and adaptation to the contemporary conditions of the collection. And Pietro Maria Bardi and Lina Bo Bardi, the couple, wanted the works to be displayed this way because they always said that the viewer should have direct contact with the work. They should look at paintings, even if they're classic paintings or world widely known paintings. They should be always seen as documents of the human condition. So this way of displaying had two reasons. One was to put the reviewer in direct contact with a work of art, and also to consider as work or as labor, imagining that abstractly, the painting still belongs on the easel of the artist. So it's a very beautiful metaphor that translates magnificently into architecture. So I had this all in mind when I started to do this exhibition and other exhibitions that Chandler mentioned. One of them was the exhibition invited by the Museum of Art in Palm Springs to establish a dialogue between Albert Frey and Lina Bo Bardi. Coincidentally, there was an editorial. I am not going to go into this. There was an editorial reason for that. And that the Lina Bo Bardi Draws exhibition in Barcelona was brought later last year to the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. And so this is the installation and the catalog that was published by Princeton University Press. And it was a very different space. It was also a wonderful collaboration. But it was a different exhibition. It was in the Center for Architecture. We had half of the 100 drawings replaced. So it was a different narrative, and trying to create a different kind of dialogue with the place, with the museum itself. But since the generator of this narrative was the exhibition in Barcelona, which is Lina Bo Bardi Dibuixa, which means draws in Catalan, we'll talk more about that also because there's more documentation. It was the initiator of this process. So I would like, before talking about the exhibition itself, I'd like to share the first video, which is a video that I prepared for the centennial of Lina Bo Bardi's birth in 2014 for the Museum of Architecture in Munich in Germany. And this was a commission by them that was to address Lina Bo Bardi's activities as a curator, as an exhibition design. And as I wrote, directed, and produced that with very little resources, with the help of three wonderful students at WashU who did a lot of the collaboration with the archives in Brazil, with Lina Bo Bardi's drawings and photographs, and also a group of musicians who records contemporary Brazilian music that had themes related to the work of Lina Bo Bardi. So always trying to bring all these different media into the project. So what you will see here is a 15-minute film, but I think it's quite entertaining and it works well in this format. Otherwise, I would never show this film. It tells us how Lina Bo Bardi thought about exhibition, which was essential for me to think about how to exhibit her work. So let's take a look at it. Sorry, I may need to do something. I need to share in a different way so that you can hear perhaps the sound. All right, here we go. Sorry for that. Okay.
Lina Bo Bardi was not a conventional architect. She had been involved with the design of exhibitions long before she conceived of the buildings that gave her work visibility. Lina Bo Bardi was not a conventional curator either. An exhibition to her was more than the display of iconic objects to convey prestige or to please the eyes. It was an invitation to wonder about artistic creation with no preconceptions of origin and meaning. She saw no distinction between the cultural relevance of a masterpiece of Western painting and of an anonymously crafted object. To Lina Bo Bardi, they were both the work of human hands. The opening of the permanent facilities of the Museum of Art of São Paulo in April 1969 epitomized Lina Bo Bardi's inclusive curatorial vision. People who lined up to explore the daring building discovered two groundbreaking exhibitions inside the suspended glazed volume. Hundreds of striking handcrafted objects from the hinterlands of Brazil greeted visitors on the first floor in an exhibition titled The Hand of the Brazilian People. Lina Bo Bardi believed this anonymous creative force to be the source for an authentic Brazilian industrial design. Visitors emerged into the second floor to encounter Western masterpieces displayed in an airy installation. Each canvas stood against a glass pane held by a concrete cube. The whole collection seemed to hover in an open gallery, unencumbered from traditional museum walls. Together, the two exhibitions that inaugurated the museum intended to transcend the hierarchies and values that separate artworks and artifacts. Lina Bo Bardi arrived at the original curatorial vision presented at MASPI from her diversified collaborations over the previous 30 years. Her first exhibition experience was the booth for Rodoid, an innovative textile for a low-cost design fair at the Triennial Pavilion in Milan, shortly before leaving for Brazil in 1946. Her display suggested the curatorial principles she would explore throughout her life: meticulous ordering, the separation of objects from walls with simple devices, and the association between traditional and modern images and artifacts. Her relationship with the art dealer and critic Pietro Maria Bardi, whom she married and followed to Brazil, enriched her curatorial experience. They collaborated closely on the creation of the groundbreaking Museum of Art of São Paulo, MASPI, between 1948 and 1950. Lina Bo Bardi adapted 2 floors of a downtown office high-rise and deployed innovative techniques to display artworks and artifacts. A long glazed container, a horizontal cabinet of curiosities, occupied a prominent place in the carefully lit gallery. Glass easels, modular tubular systems, and suspended plywood panel systems projected the works away from the walls. Lina Bo Bardi also projected her curatorial experience beyond MASPI's boundaries. In 1951, she designed the facilities for the State of São Paulo Agricultural Exposition. That same year, she prepared a study for a modern art museum on the coastal town of San Vicente. She imagined a semi-transparent volume resembling Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall and interior perspectives that recalled Italian metaphysical paintings. Together, those images prefigured her preliminary project for MASPI's permanent facilities in 1957. During the 12 years that it took to build MASPI, Lina Bo Bardi gained professional autonomy. Her experience in Salvador between 1958 and 1964 helped hone her aesthetic and political sympathies, embracing the struggles for the socialization of culture in Brazil. She expected Brazilian design and architecture to stem out of people's everyday practices and aspire to create an alternative industrial design school. In 1959, she assisted theater director Martin Gonçalves in staging the Bahia exhibition under the concrete canopy facing the São Paulo Biennial Pavilion. Lina Bo Bardi had the space enclosed with fabric, leading visitors into a large hall covered with leaves and filled with innumerable makeshift artifacts from the Brazilian hinterland. She described the event as a show of cultural anthropology rather than art, the extreme simplicity of expressive means, that she would pursue until the end of her life. In 1960, she became the director of the new Museum of Modern Art of Bahia in Salvador. She created a museum with limited resources and abundant ingenuity. She used floor-to-ceiling drapes to transform the glazed lobby of Castro Alves Theater into an exhibition hall, and sliding curtains to create separable rooms. She designed simple adjustable metal easels and modular plywood stands to host almost 100 art, design, and craft exhibitions between 1960 and 1964. Her experience in Salvador branched out into the creation of the Museum of Popular Art in 1963 with the adaptive reuse of the historical Union estate. The centerpiece of her architectural project featured a staircase whose joinery pays tribute to traditional woodwork. She envisioned a documentation center serving an industrial design school that would have brought together local artisanal practices and university education into the museum. This short-lived institution opened with the Nordeste exhibition, a display of makeshift artifacts appealing to the region's social problems. Each object touches the threshold of nothingness, of poverty, Lina Bo Bardi wrote at the time, blending romantic impulses with revolutionary rhetoric. After the 1964 military coup d'etat, Lina Bo Bardi left Salvador and gradually lost her confidence in idealistic cultural projects. In the following decade, she saw the completion of her audacious MASPI project with its emblematic collection hall and thought-provoking temporary exhibitions. From the 1970s until her death in 1992, she continued to collaborate on exhibitions informed by cultural anthropology. The show Repassos, or Weaving Patterns, at MASPI in 1975 presented works from an experimental textile workshop for underprivileged artisans in the hinterland of Brazil. Large tapestries, documents, and live reenactment revealed the process for handing down popular weaving techniques, echoing Lina Bo Bardi's abandoned idea for a popular design school. In 1977, she started to work on her paradigmatic architectural project, the Sesc Pompeia Cultural and Leisure Center. Between 1982 and 1985, she collaborated with the center's research team to set up large-scale educational exhibitions in the former factory building. The first one of those epic shows was Design in Brazil, History and Reality. Small and large objects, ranging from indigenous ceramic pieces to airline mock-ups, flooded the space to show the hand and the industry of the Brazilian people. Another significant exhibition promoted by Sesc Pompeia was 1,000 Toys for the Brazilian Children. The team, coordinated by Lina Bo Bardi, presented a massive inventory of makeshift and industrial play objects as a protest against the commodification of children's entertainment. Following this critical approach, Lina Bo Bardi helped design the exhibition Peasants' Bumpkins, Wattle and Daub in 1984. A colorful grove of maypoles welcomed visitors into a staged farmyard, surrounded by replicas of simple buildings intended to present the vanishing culture of traditional Brazilian country dwellers. Following her work for Sesc Pompeia, Lina Bo Bardi designed a series of cultural institutions related to the urban revitalization of the historical district of Salvador between 1986 and 1989. The House of Benin stands out for its architectural and curatorial features. The two lower floors of the main house displayed handicraft from the West African country and photographs documenting cultural exchanges between Brazil and Africa. Lina Bo Bardi had the concrete columns wrapped in woven straw and bolts of colorful textiles draped from the ceiling, undulating above the display cases. Simultaneously to this installation, she organized Black Africa, her last exhibition at Maspi, suggesting a yard for religious candomblé ceremonies. The circular space was surrounded by glass display cases with African cult objects, woven coconut tree leaves, and banners of the same colorful textile used in Salvador. She told the press, "We are going to invade São Paulo and Bahia with this exhibition." A few months before her death, and with other cultural invasions in mind, she engaged in the project for her last, though unrealized, epic exhibition. She participated in the design competition for the Brazilian Pavilion at the 1992 World Exposition in Seville, Spain, intended to commemorate the European exploration of the Americas. Instead of celebrating the deeds of conquistadors, she proposed a memorial to the American peoples since pre-Columbian times. The pavilion was to offer everyday food with native ingredients and show indigenous festivities. As a centerpiece, she imagined displaying archaeological documents and the oldest human remains found in the South American continent. Had the pavilion been built, Lina Bo Bardi would have staged, at the edge of death, a synthesis of the curatorial values and practices she honed throughout her career. More than pleasing the eyes, her exhibition sought the emancipation of human life. She never abandoned her aspiration to a cultural authenticity that was historically grounded and that could be collectively shared.
Okay, so I hope that you were entertained by the video. It spoke much better than I could in 15 minutes about Lina Bo Bardi's life, her work as an architect, as a curator, as a polymath. And I think you can see very clearly that she had this incredible ability of being very connected to the places and the people she worked to, but also to navigate between architecture and the other fields of human knowledge and expression and artistic and cultural expression. So when I was invited to create this dialogue with Lina Bo Bardi, and I would say also with Jean Miró and Josep Risset, who designed the Miró Foundation in Barcelona, I feel like it was a very exciting, but also very scary task, because it's like a dialogue with three huge monsters of the 20th century. So by placing Lina Bo Bardi inside this building, in the memory of the architecture that is in Montjuic in the Mediterranean, and with this beautiful selection of spaces, as you can see, the whiteness and the terracotta, the simplicity of the architecture, the vaulted ceilings. And what you can see here in this picture of the foundation of the park is that you have the traditional CERT building, and then the addition that was done later, and that's exactly where the exhibition was located. We had a lot of space, and we also had a lot of works to select from. And however, the budget was limited, so I had to choose out of about 6,000 drawings that Lina Bo Bardi did throughout her life, as you can see here from the archives digitally organized in Brazil. I had to select 100 of those drawings. So the challenge was very big because the drawings are small, the space was big, and they're varied drawings. So basically what I decided to do is to organize a chronological narrative together with a thematic narrative. But before we talk about the exhibition, I'd just like to read from the catalog, the first page, the prologue. And it tells a story about two drawings that I think are not well known, but are very meaningful. So in the early 1990, in early 1990, at the end of her life, Lina Bo Bardi produced a small, colorful drawing of vines with flowers, butterflies, bees, beetles, and other insects. 3 days later, she folded the drawing to form a card and added another drawing on the left side of the spread. She was 75 years old and had mastered graphic conventions. Yet her drawing had the light-hearted shapes and colors of the ones she made as a child. As her sight diminished, her writing became larger and her joints stiffened. She struggled to hold pens and brushes, making her drawings uneven, economic, and expressive at the same time. Still, neither debilitation limited her imagination. At the center of the folded card, she sketched a red heart-shaped flower and added above it a blue crescent moon and a yellow sun. On the cover, she wrote, "To Pietro, Lina," in playful, ornate letters. Despite the physical hardships of aging, Bo Bardi had complete command over the intent, gesture, and effect of the marks she put on paper, the kind of control she started to hone in her artistic education in Rome in the early 1930s, before studying architecture. During that formative period, she produced a carefully drawn study of an upright plant in a flower pot, standing against an oversized window as it looks for light. This image, like the vines in her card to Pietro, her husband, is simple yet full of affect. Constructed around a distant and low vanishing point, it shows her skills in Renaissance perspective, enhancing the classic grandiosity of the architecture that was becoming common in Italy at that time. Simultaneously, the image is immersed in an atmosphere of modernist metaphysical painting. This framing, whether intentional or a copy, reveals an awareness of the cultural and artistic values around her, her introspective personality, and her audacity. In both drawings, single stem plants stand alone and determined, as Bo Bardi often did throughout her life. Through drawings, she expressed in silence what she could probably not articulate with words. So I'm just going to show you a few of the drawings that were in the exhibition, trying to organize this chronological order and also talk about the theme. So these are drawings from her childhood and her adolescence. So the first drawing, which curiously at the age of 9, is called L'Albero Morto, which means the dead tree. Very interesting if you're interested in a psychoanalytic perspective. And then she moves to paint these urban scenes that in a way was referring to her father's very fantasistic compositions. But then as she became an adolescent, she became more interested in feminine themes, and her drawings were quite dramatic of women and young women in situations of peril. And finally, as a young adult, she regained her humor. And you can see here a caricature she made of her sister at the day of her wedding with her very tall husband, Mario, who she compares to a giraffe. And here we also have a demonstration of another kind of skill that Bo Bardi developed in high school, or the Liceo Artistico, which she went to in Rome in the early 1930s. You can see the beauty and the rigor of the compositions, the proportions that she learned from the Beaux-Arts and the classical traditions. They were common at that time. But then as she evolved and she moved to Milan, she started a career as an illustrator. So you see here some of the work she did, which is not sketches, but they're more finished. And they're not necessarily only architectural. They are also telling stories. They are suggesting dreams and illustrating articles that she edited for magazines. Following that, you also have drawings that are of travels. Here you see in 1946, her trip living on a ship, Naples, and you can see the Vesuvius with its smoke. And still you see some debris from the war and some ship in the city that is quietly watching her leave. And arriving in Rio in a very colorful watercolor that shows this incredible mix of this very cosmopolitan city that had international theaters, but also had people on the street in the rain. And I love this truck that shows two men sitting on top of a box, perhaps carrying some goods. And it looks like a carnival float. So she made this drawing for a few days from her hotel room, and she sent it to her father, who copied and kept a copy for himself as a way of having this kind of a silent dialogue, being the person who introduced her to drawings. You also have another category of drawings, and these abound in the collection. They're her thinking drawings in architecture. These show a design of a chair that took several years to organize based on a Tuscan chair that she wanted to be folded but done with Brazilian wood, and also the detail of a staircase that she designed following a floral motif, since she was very interested in organic themes in architecture, not only in rationalist or modern, in the modern language. We also have these more dramatic moments when she worked for theaters, and imagining on the left side, we have the theater that she designed inside of a burned down theater for a Camus play, the Caligula. And also this beautiful, very rare drawing done on black paper showing at night how she imagined the auditorium of the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo. So this is quite expressive and quite architectural, and just the spatiality of these drawings is absolutely fascinating. And see, these are also drawings that she did for exhibitions. The left one is before she left Milan to go to Brazil. She designed an exhibition for furniture. And on the right side, at late life, this was an exhibition she imagined for the opening of the sports courts that are stacked on these two towers, celebrating the history of soccer or football in Brazil. And for her, it was always this idea of a Gesamtkunstwerk, or a total work of art, a theatrical performance with music, with people, with food, with colors, with photographs, with all kinds of elements that she found outside of her world and also in her inner life, in her inner world. And then finally, we have her architectural studies, and because she kept these very carefully, we can also understand her thinking. For example, this is of the Museum of Art of São Paulo that we now know as being a glass box elevated from the ground. For a long time, she pursued it being an organic representation of pebbles and plants, but because of a technical issue, this could not be built. But you can see her desire for this to be a very different museum that she actually ended up building, or the staircase that now is orthogonal, that she had imagined in several studies as also having an organic floral motif, and very beautiful, quick sketches, but very aware of the same shadows that we see in that drawing of the plants she made when she was in the Liceo. So she knew when to use the resources and the skills and the values and rules of traditional drawings, but she also knew how to abandon them in a gesture of great freedom and a great imagination. So with all this in mind, and with the challenge, I went into designing the exhibition for the museum. And in one of the drawings that I included, I wanted to include this one, which was an exhibition that she designed for the original Museum of Art of São Paulo in 1948, where she shows this display of images that she wanted to be detached from walls, always either in easels, which build on the tradition of architects such as Frank Albini, a Milanese who she knew very well. And by referring to this element, which is basically a very light tubular element, like a post, I decided to emulate some of these characters of exhibitions that she used in the materials, such as detaching the drawings as much as possible from the walls, or using fabric as a way of separating rooms, since the rooms are very large. And we also had very limited resources, and we had very large spaces. And as I wanted to tell this narrative, and given the selection of 100 drawings and the number of rooms that we had, the best solution was to separate the drawings in 4 different groups, being the first one dedicated to plants, which have to do with her ideas about nature and her discussions with Bruno Zevi about organic architecture. And this would be the first room to enter. And I wanted to give people the impact of going into the woods and going into a space that celebrated her way of displaying the works themselves by placing these posts and all the paint on all the drawings moved towards the person who's arriving in this room, and then create these hanging panels that were translucent with text, which had to be in 4 languages: French, Catalan, Spanish, and English, and with images of Lina Bo Bardi, so people could be acquainted with her as a person, as she aged, and the different places that she lived. So here we have a few sketches that I did as I was thinking about this exhibition, as we did a lot of it via email, and I went to Barcelona a few times, but most of the work was done here in St. Louis. So the communication was always through drawings with them. So you see on the left and right, you have the first room dedicated to plants, with this idea of the posts that are allocated according to the order of Louis Sert's a voted ceiling. So that also helped to technically place them, but also create a rhythm for people to go through the spaces. The second room, which was the largest and most, the brightest one, and that was the one that I dedicated to people and to Lina Bo Bardi idea about how human beings belong. She always said that human beings were the protagonists of space and not buildings and or forms. In the middle, you have this transitional space that brings us to the two floors underneath. One was sort of the projection of the for the projection of the video that you just saw. And even lower, there was the pedagogical space where we had workshops organized, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And then finally, to the right, you see on the top, the room that is dedicated to Lina Bo Bardi's graphic work, which and the objects that she designed. So it was a small scale, it was a smaller room, the smallest room, and the large one at the end was the apotheosis of her work as an architect. And so everything that was dedicated to museums, to cultural spaces, to architecture in general, to theater, and to even urban projects that she did. And to this one, I decided in order to enlarge the wall space and also to detach them from the wall, to use something that was there in the museum, which is a series of scaffoldings. So trying to use what was available in the place, as she perhaps would have done. As she always said, I never had money to do the things that I did. So in that sense, I try to be in dialogue with her sense of simplicity, but not being simplistic. The other thing that for me was a lot of fun as well is because Lina Bo Bardi enjoyed including sounds and the exhibition and other elements. I discovered that in Barcelona, there is a group of musicians who have collected sounds of the city. And they have a large archive of these sounds and noises of Barcelona. So in conversation with a composer whose name is Andres, oh my God, I forgot his name. Sorry for that. Anyway, he is in charge of this archive of phonos. And I decided to compose, since I played cello and piano, I decided to compose a piece based on the sounds that were available in the archives. And in conversation with him, select some pieces that related to plants or nature, sounds of nature, people walking, or people talking, and children for these different rooms, or sounds of people working in an office, or sounds of construction work, or sounds of the city. So each one of these rooms had two loudspeakers, and so it was a composition in two voices. And it was done in a way that they echoed back and forth with these surprising sounds and silences along the way. So it was my moment of fun with John Cage in the exhibition, but also trying to make this theatrical with a very subtle way for the people who entered these rooms. Unfortunately, I don't have a recording, but here we have the 4 pictures of these rooms as they were published officially. So the first one dedicated to plants where you entered, and all these drawings from her childhood all the way to the end of her life, dedicated to this idea of the organic or the botanic. The room dedicated to people and to Lina Bo Bardi herself. In the middle, we have her only self-portrait displayed in that centerpiece of the exhibition. The text that explained the exhibition and the pictures throughout her life. We have this smaller room dedicated to her graphic work, posters, and exhibition design and furniture design, and a lot of it that she did for illustrations of magazines that she did in Italy and in Brazil. And finally, we had the last room, large room, that was dedicated to her architectural work. And you can see her picture here during the construction site at MASP, the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo. And there was also a special moment in the space of transition to the to the lower floors, there's this beautiful window, and Harper had given us the right to use one of their reconstructed models of Lina Bo Bardi's bow. And so the idea suggested that we replicate her house. There's this famous picture of Lina Bo Bardi in the glass house in Sao Paulo looking through the window. So this was a way of bringing her here in this moment of awe, as she liked to call these moments in which you stop and think. So you could be sitting there with her at home before you continue with the exhibition. Finally, I'd just like to show you, since Lina Bo Bardi appreciated people so much, some of these pictures during the opening and seeing the interaction of people. You can also see here behind how the display with the paintings were turned only to the front side. And a detail to the left top is Lina Bo Bardi in those Africa exhibitions that she did, because in the candomblé traditions in Brazil, people use leaves as a way of cleaning up the space spiritually. So I went to a herb place in Barcelona in the downtown and bought a lot of these dried eucalyptus leaves, which she once used, and for the opening, because there are problems with conservation. So they only placed there for the opening, but it was also a tribute to her. So you could come in and you could smell. So it was a multi-sensorial. There was the sounds, there was the smell, there was the vision, there was the presence of the body and the colors, etc. And so this was, in a way, my dialogue with her, with Jean Miro, whose work is next to this in direct dialogue, and also being inside this incredible building that feels at the same time quite monumental and very, very intimate and pleasant and domestic in a homey way. So I just like to share, before we talk about this last phase, I'd like to share the last video, which is the production of the exhibition that was done by the Miro Foundation. So here we have, I'm sorry, this is perhaps not connecting. Oh, here. Let me enlarge this. Okay, this is quite short. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Lina Bo Bardi was probably one of the most important art.
I'm sorry, I think I have to share the sound, otherwise you can hear it. Just making sure. Thank you for your patience.
Texts in the 20th century, and Lina Bo Bardi was probably one of the most important architects in the 20th century, and she had a very interesting life and career. She grew up in Italy. She worked there until the Second World War, and she moved to Brazil in 1946, where she developed all of her career. She had a very special relationship with drawing. If people have looked at her drawings, they will realize that she would draw something between an artist and an architect. And this is what is so important for the exhibition that we're developing at the Jean Miro Foundation. We're looking specifically at how she appropriated drawing as a medium of expression, not only as an architect, but also as a person who had so multiple interests in life. We have worked directly with the Lina Bo Bardi archives, which are located in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And in this collection that she has in Sao Paulo, she left about 6,000 drawings, and we have selected 100 of them to be here in the exhibition. And we have decided for two different approaches. One of them is that these drawings should be chronological. They should represent everything she did in her life from the very early age of 9 years old to the end of her life. At the same time, we would like to bring about some of the themes that interested her in her work and in the daily use of drawing and the relationship she had with the medium. So we'll see among these 100 drawings many different qualities and techniques, and I think that this is really interesting about the way that she drew and as a way of thinking, as an extension of her questions about architecture, about people, about plants. So we hope that this will give people access to her mind and the way that she connected her mind and her hands through drawing. And I especially here at the Jean Miro Foundation, where we have this incredible artist who also drew so profusely and so obsessively. I think it's a beautiful combination. They both use colors in such a beautiful way. And also the location of the museum, which is in a park. And Lina Bo Bardi loved plants. She loved the environment and nature. We'll start this exhibition by looking at her drawings about plants and vegetation. And we'll go from there to look at the other interests that she had in people who she considered to be the protagonists of architecture. And from there we'll look at the objects that she designed and also the buildings and the spaces that she was so interested in as an architect, as a designer, as a theater director, as a curator. And so many of the activities she developed. And in all of them, drawing was always present as a means of communication, exploration, thinking, and expression.
I love how they finished the video with him whistling. It's quite nice. So let me share the other screen. And so this is just to complete this conversation or lecture by showing a final activity that was, I'm so sorry, why isn't this working? Oh. Drawing with Lina Bo Bardi, for all the public who went to the exhibition, we wanted to create the possibility of having activities. The Jean Miro Foundation has a very strong pedagogical program, very interesting people working there, and very serious artists and historians and pedagogues. So we discussed the possibility of using a very large space underground, which is used for these pedagogical activities, to create a space where people could draw. And so I produced these drawings that you see here based on Lina Bo Bardi's drawings, which were for children to color. And we also invited a Cuban artist who lives in Barcelona to draw these spaces that were inspired in Lina Bo Bardi's work with black tape. And so this was a city, that imaginary city that people would go inside and contribute with their own drawings. So here you see a workshop that I taught about making an origami book by walking around the park and walking around the museum and having this kind of a reflection collectively about Lina Bo Bardi and Jean Miro and Louis Sert. And also you see in the background that space already filled up with these incredible collages. You see Lina Bo Bardi being placed there that spontaneously were contributions throughout the 3 months that the exhibition took place. And I think this is an incredible tribute that every single person who went to the space with children, adults, it doesn't matter whom, left anonymously this commentary on their lives, on Lina Bo Bardi, on their appreciation of the work itself. So unfortunately, this picture is out of focus, but you can see how dynamic the space was also, and not just the exhibitions upstairs. So I just like to conclude this by reading the epilogue of the catalog that tells the story of this drawing, which I think is quite fascinating. And when the exhibition, and before reading it, I'd just like to say that when the exhibition was brought and redesigned for the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, I once received an email from them about a journalist who wrote an article about the show. And she, without knowing me, really, I think, captured the work that I did for it by saying that the exhibition had been a work of, the curatorial work had been a project of great rigor and tenderness. And this is what I'd like to leave you with, this idea of rigor, which was also very present in Lina Bo Bardi's work, but also this incredible tenderness that she had for what she did and for the people who she imagined. So I'll read this last page. The woman who once said she did not want to become a painter of flowers when she was in liceo in high school did like to draw plants. As Bo Bardi renovated the old factory to house Cesc Pompeia and its iconic concrete blocks, she included numerous organic references in her work. She illustrated a poster for the Leisure Center with such allusions, summarizing her personal disposition and design approach. Here it is. On the left side of the page, she made a drawing of the slender tower designed for the sports facilities, cast with irregular rings in the rock concrete. She drew dozens of small flowers emerging from the top of the tower, employing circular gestures that mirror those in her childhood drawings. A few isolated flowers appear lower on the page, suggesting a slow cascading movement as they float, resisting gravity. Bo Bardi produced a series of over 30 small sketches to conceive the layout and typography of the logo for Cesc Pompeia. Her initial sketch represented the factory's sheds, but she soon developed a floral concept to several variations, fine-tuning the image's proportions and visual relationships to give the impression of spontaneity. Although Bo Bardi liked to say she had forsaken the conventions of her classical arts education, this example is reminiscent of her able sprezzatura, a Renaissance rule of studied nonchalance, gracefulness concealing the effort that goes into looking elegant. Her logo for Cesc Pompeia projects the casual, optimistic sense of grace and liveliness found everywhere in the center's facilities. The tall cylinder in her project simultaneously suggests and denies the image of a traditional industrial chimney holding water, one of life's most valuable natural assets, instead of soot. And the smokestack in her picture delights viewers with surrealistic charm. Instead of offering fumes to the city and to people, it showers them with white flowers. Lina Bo Bardi culled images from the many worlds around her and created a language that let go of conventions, and she strived to find meaning in the contingencies of life and offered her work as a generous, loving gesture to those in its presence. And I hope that you were able to experience this by virtually going through this exhibition with us. Thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions that you may have.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Zeuler. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. You can also put them in the chat. We'll be looking out for those. There was a question that, or question comment, not quite sure, from William Wallace. Maybe you could expand on that.
Yeah, if he could, I don't know what.
Yeah. Yeah, it came after around the second video, so not too long ago that question came. I'm not really sure. If you could expand on that, that would be great.
I hope that I answered somehow to this through the videos, and yeah.
Yeah, while questions come in, yeah, I guess I'm a bit. This was really great to understand a little bit more about Lina Bo Bardi and the way she approached her curatorial work in particular. Um, what do you what was okay? Well, William just wrote it. After she moved to Brazil, do you
Mm.
see Italy still in her work
Oh,
or thinking?
yeah. Oh, of course. Bill Wallace is asking, do you, after she moved to Brazil, do you see Italy still in her work or thinking? I would say absolutely yes. I think she never stopped being Italian. It's interesting that, I'm currently finishing the production of a biography that I'm publishing in Brazil about her. So there I dive more into her personal life and her private letters, even a letter that she wrote to her husband, Pietro Maria Bardi, when she was in Brazil and debating what had happened to them. They were not Italian anymore. They were not Brazilian, and she felt like she had set roots in Brazil, but she had some doubts about that. In the end, she says to him, um, I think we're like epiphytes. We're like bromeliads. Bromeliads don't set roots on the ground. They set roots on top of trees, like in the Amazon forest. And I think that that's a very beautiful metaphor. She was so bright and intelligent, and she used the plant to describe herself, which means she continued to think like an Italian, but she also absorbed, she acquired a culture that was Brazilian. She loved the country where she moved to. She had a very important role in redesigning Brazilian architecture and culture. And I think, you know, it's like languages. You acquire a language and you start to belong to that culture. You're not born into that culture, but she acquired a culture that was not hers. And I think many people ask, and especially the debate between Brazil and Italy, and for a long time, Italians did not claim Lina Bo Bardi as an architect. And since the centennial, there has been an enormous interest. And so this biography is also being translated in Italian and is coming out next year. Um, so the question is always, was she Italian or Brazilian? I would say she was both. And she was both. Like we are all becoming always something new. And William Wallace is saying, you'd like to read the biography? Yes, there's an English version, and eventually it's going to come out in English. It has a much more psychoanalytic perspective to it. So I hope that I answered your question. So she did continue being Italian, and you can see that in the work she did for architecture, the discussions she had with all these Italian, like Bruno Zevi was always present in her discussion about modern architecture and what would become of a critical version of rationalism. And she gave a different interpretation. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
So got another question in the Q&A. At the time when Lina Bo Bardi began to work in Brazil, there were very few women who managed to be recognized in architecture. She was kind of a pioneer for professional women in Latin America.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Rodolfo. Coming from Colombia, that's very nice. Yes, she was a pioneer, but she did not set out to be a pioneer. I think she was very brave, and she had no other option in life but to live what she wanted to live. And of course, she left an incredible example, but that example is only very recently being valued as such. I remember that when I was in architecture school in the 1980s, and you can see how old I am right now, in Sao Paulo, and where she lived, nobody talked about Lina Bo Bardi, and she already had these two amazing MASPI, the museum, and SESC, the cultural center, built and visited by everybody and loved by everybody. But nobody talks about, nobody taught. There's no historian talking about Lina Bo Bardi. There's perhaps one or two, but they was not part of our curriculum. And she was local. So you can imagine how difficult it was for her. And I would say as a foreigner, as a woman, also as someone who thought very differently. She was outside of the mainstream at the same time she was inside it, and I think that's what made her so fascinating as a thinker, as a public intellectual. I think she aspired to be someone who had an intellectual contribution to architecture and culture. And I think this is what makes her so Italian and not American from the Americas. Because in Italy, architecture has always had this very deep rooted investment in discourse and narrative and debate and criticism. And she was part of that. She was a curator, she was an editor, she started her profession saying, well, I was an architect when during the war, everything was destroyed, nothing was built. So she created paper architecture. She created architecture with words, with images. And yeah, she was a pioneer to women, I think, in the world and not only in Latin America. I think sometimes they're very, 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 very different, but I think she deserves the recognition that Frida Kahlo had in painting. They're very different, of course, the work that they did. And Frida Kahlo was much more appealing because the pictures were so strikingly powerful. And I tried to do this by showing these drawings by Lina Bo Bardi so that people know a much more personal dimension of her life, her work, and her way of thinking. Yeah.
So we've got a question from Chantel Blakely. Thank you for your lecture. What would you say were the sources of Lina Bo Bardi's tectonic sensibility, the dramatic structural aspects of her buildings?
Mm-hmm. This is very interesting, Chantel. Thank you for your question. I would say it's always like in everything about Lina Bo Bardi, it's very ambiguous and very mixed. It's very hybrid. The later work, I believe, has to do with trying to deal with the dimension and participating in the mainstream of architecture in Brazil. So the large buildings are built in raw concrete. In that sense, she belonged to the traditions of post-war modernism. And I think you can see people like the Smithsons who did, of course, there's Le Corbusier, there's all these architects, but I think there's other architects who are less known. That had some relationship to her work. She even, for the towers at SESC, for example, she was very enamored of Barragán's satellite city monument. So her references came from everywhere. However, I would say that there is much deeper root in this. What is the word that you use, Chantal? Let me read again. In the dramatic structural aspects of her building, it's tectonic sensibility. I think this tectonic sensibility comes from her classical training and growing up in Rome. You have to remember that in the 1930s, when she was studying architecture, Mussolini was uncovering the city, getting rid of all the tenements and uncovering, because he wanted to be recognized as the new Augustus. So he monumentalized the city. And so Lina Bo Bardi was very aware of all that Roman antiquity of very simple buildings. So if you look at her drawings, architectural drawings, they're very simple. The space is like a basilica. They're always a box. And you look inside, there's this clear one point, vanishing point Renaissance perspective. It's very simple, but very heavy, stern building. And then it became lighter after her influences of Milanese architecture and also her husband, Pietro Maria Bardi, who was one of the advocates of rationalist architecture, including being an advocate of glass and transparency in architecture, which was not a topic that was so interested in. If you look at the smaller buildings that she built and the houses, they're always very grounded. They're always coming out of the natural environment. They're rarely lifted. So I would say that the buildings that she was more recognized for, because perhaps it's more related to the mainstream discourse, is the Museum Masp that is lifted from the ground, and her glass house, which if you look, the back of the house, the tectonic, it relates to a farmhouse. Very simple structures, enclosed walls, no details. So this simplicity of construction, I think, comes from the straightforwardness of her background, her knowledge of classical architecture and everyday architecture. She was not talking about the temple. She was talking about the market, you know, the basilica, the meeting space, and that's what interested her. She was very dedicated to this idea of everyday life. So when people, she was very, very careful in 1968, for example, and I'll finish here with this answer. In 1968, when MASP was opened, it was during the height of the military dictatorship in Brazil, she was very afraid of being confused with a monument that she knew in the tradition of Mussolini, which was always this idea of monuments being dedicated to celebrating a dictator or a dictatorship. So she tried to say, no, this actually was a very simple construction system. And actually it was the engineer who she worked with, who was recognized as a genius engineer in Brazil. He created a very simple system of construction of these large beams of the hanging slabs, and which was done manually. There's no high technology used at that time. So, and if you look at the construction site, it's beautiful. I think that in the film I show there's all these scaffoldings of eucalyptus. It looks like you go into a forest of, you know, sometimes you see more lately in Southeastern Asia, the construction of these scaffoldings with bamboo. And that's what was available. And that's what held this massive structure of concrete. And I think that we should not lose that out of sight, because the construction process is where the simplicity is. It's not in the performance of the spanning. And the spanning has to do with the fact that she needed to leave that space open because it was a demand from the site itself. So I hope that I answered your question. And I think that there's two more. There's no other question, so that's fine.
Well, there's a couple. Let's see. Your deep dive into her drawings, did you find any themes in terms of size, medium, etc.? The examples you showed today seem so diverse.
Yeah, she has small drawings that are as small as this piece of paper, and a lot of them she did on her desk out of a A5 little newsprint paper, and that's where most of the work is. She did works that are perhaps A3, you know, using the Brazilian European measurement. And rarely she did big drawings, because she never aspired the drawings to be work of arts standing on their own. Even as a child, when she was training in school, they were study drawings, they were process drawings. They were never expected to be in an exhibition. They're very private documents. They were part of her dialogue with herself. The only drawing that is really large, which was one of the last drawings that she produced in her life, which is about 1.5 meters long and about perhaps 70 centimeters tall. It's quite large, and it was in the exhibition in Barcelona. it was the drawing she made for an extension to the city hall in Sao Paulo, which was a vertical garden. I mean, she even imagined that when nobody imagined these vertical gardens. And it's one of the most beautiful drawings that she produced, with very colorful examples of Brazilian flora. And so that is quite an exception that was done to impress the mayor and impress, convince them to design it. But otherwise, the format is quite intimate. And I think that's the way that I tried to place these drawings in the exhibition, so that the viewer could come close and feel like it was a document, and feel like she was there drawing with Lina Bo Bardi. So I hope I answered the question.
I've got a question from Patty Hayda. Resistances did Lina Bo Bardi encounter in response to her subtle or more outward forms of activism / critiques in her art?
Can you repeat that as a question?
Sure, sure. What resistances did Lina Bo Bardi encounter?
Oh,
Yeah.
a lot, all kinds of resistance. As I said, because first, because she was a woman, and she already in Italy, she was believed, even within her family, she was discouraged to study architecture because women didn't study architecture. Her father had a building business, so he was a painter. That was his love. So he imagined her going to the academia and then becoming a painter or an artist. But she insisted, and she wanted to be an architect since very early. And she faced a lot of resistance being a woman in architecture school. She also resisted the separation of labor that existed when she went to Milan. Of course, there was not a lot of work as architects, but she said that she tried to get a job at Giuseppe Pagano's office. She wasn't accepted. She said that she worked with Gio Ponti, but she actually was a freelance with him. And she was also a very strong person. She had a very difficult temper. So it was not easy to be around her. So that didn't make friendships very easy with her. She was a very demanding person. So there was this resistance also personally. So there was the fact that she was a woman, the division of labor, there was her character. And then when she went to Brazil, she was also seen as this very tight European. She met, right in Rio, she met Lúcio Costa and Niemeyer, who were the architects at the time, the architects of the king. There was a dictator in Brazil at that time. And they said to her, "Oh, you make so many drawings. Why do you do that? Here in Brazil, we just use this. You just use a stick and we draw on the dirt and we show it to the construction foreman." And she said, "I know, I was more impressed when I met Niemeyer, not by his ideas, but because he was wearing a lilac coat." And so, she also made fun of these people. She was a quite belligerent person. I think she should have been. So there was a resistance to the fact that she was a woman continuously. There's also the problem that she was married to Pietro Maria Bardi, who was considered to have collaborated with Mussolini when he went to Brazil, and the association they had with the man who created MASP, who was like a Murdoch of Brazilian press. He was a magnate who was very powerful, but also very unscrupulous. So there was a group of Brazilian artists and who were more left-leaning, who accused the Bardi couple of being right wing, and so they wouldn't connect with them because of that. And that was not true. There was much more ambiguity with that. So in Brazil, she felt again this prejudice and resistance against being a woman, being a foreigner, and having very different ideas. And then in the 1960s, during the dictatorship, when she became the museum director in Salvador, she became very independent from her husband. She became very independent, and she founded a group of very interesting artists and anthropologists and theater directors who were very left-leaning. And in Salvador, she finally found the place where she could exercise all her her interest is in architecture and design, and also become the person who she had been rehearsing to become. And of course, she suffered a lot of resistance that then fell on her as a political label, because she ended up suffering persecution from the dictatorship, and so it continued. And then, as I said at the end, she was put in the ostracism by her Sao Paulo colleagues, and they looked at her as this person who had done work that perhaps created a lot of jealousy, and she was never really integrated, and she did not make herself want to be integrated. And I think she stood alone, and then she was brave, she was courageous, and very curious. So, and the other thing that I would say, there was her response to all this resistance. She had this incredible ability to be adaptable. She was like a sponge, and she would respond to the world around her. So the drawings show how she was able to maintain her values, but her output aesthetically and culturally changed with her times. And we generally see architects who follow a line to the end of their life, so they create a language, and they can become prisoners of that. And I think that this is another example that she gives us of someone who really knew how to use her freedom, and she paid a high price for that, but she did it.
Well, maybe this is a good place to end. It was very informative, not just of her work, but of her, and all of the the effort and the context in which she was working. So this is really a tremendously great lecture, Zeuler. Thank you so much.
Well, I spent 20 years with this relationship with someone I never met. So I was married to Lina Bo Bardi, and I wanted to be respectful, but also not to create a hagiography. It's not a study of saints. So I wanted to be as truthful to the facts, and to allow her to have a voice, but also to allow people to understand the ambiguities and the contradictions without being judgmental, and somehow give her the love that she deserved. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope that it was informative and entertaining in this very difficult format where nobody sees anybody. So thanks again.
Right, thank you.